And,
My memory is fading at my age now, as you know. And this will be more an oral interview. I don't have all the documentation.
No, that's
and
fine.
there's no need for it.
Right, this is to give us
Yeah.
a broad
Yeah.
overview. And you were athletic director at Stanford from what years to?
72 to the beginning of 79, through 78.
Okay, and this was a period of big change.
Yeah, it was. In fact, it started actually in the interview for the position. I really never intended to apply for the athletic directorship because I had been in fundraising for, golly, I think it was almost 15 years up till that time. And one of the members of the Stanford Athletic Board asked me if I would like to have me apply. And, well, I thought about it, and I had been through a couple of cancer operations, and I was getting a little dead in the water even in fundraising. You can run out. I've talked to people like Wally Sterling and others who say that after 10 years, sometimes it's time to get to a new track. So I put my name in, never expecting even to be considered, but it started that way. And at the first interview, and it was an interesting panel that interviewed me. Fred Argonon, the old director of admissions, was on the panel. Wonderful guy. Members of the Buck Club, some faculty, and one of the questions they asked was, what do you think about women's athletics? Quite frankly, I had never really seen, aside from being in South Bend, Indiana, seeing a women's softball team, a professional team years ago, had never really seen or followed women's athletics, even at Stanford. Of course, I was gone most of the time from Stanford. And so I just went back to the basic principles. Number one, I had watched the Olympics, and I knew there were some great women athletes of other countries. And number two, there was another factor, and that is we were claiming in athletics, because I've always viewed athletics as a game, not as the way it is now, which is now really highly professionalized, and it's on a dollar basis rather than fun basis. I had always viewed the camaraderie, the relationships you build in a program mean an awful lot, and they certainly couldn't be sex restricted. So I told them that, and that was my basis on my feeling toward women's athletics at the time. I think the important thing, though, was that after I was appointed and talking with Dick Lyman, Dick was very instrumental in getting this whole thing going. He was very strongly in favor of a women's athletic program. He was strongly in favor of moving toward that. And the first thing he did was ask me to work with the women's department in talking back and forth about our respective programs. And he appointed Ed Shaw, who was one of Dick's assistants, to kind of supervise the program. And he was with us all the time to make sure that progress was being made. So it was a relatively slow process for a while because you had to overcome some hurdles. There were some concerns, I'm sure, on the women's side, about all of a sudden here's the men's program that, has such visibility and everything, and they're going to take us over, and then we're going to be subjected to this, that, and the other thing. So we worked that out, and one of the things that I did fairly early, well, not even fairly early, it took about a year, I'd say, was to, number one, assess the women's program naturally. And then number two, to start exposing and showing our budget to the women's department, because it was amazing to me, I had not realized it. We, of course, are what we call a self-sufficient organization. The athletic department was auxiliary, live on your own money, mainly at that time football, basketball income. The women's program was being supported from general funds. And I think to the tune of about $200,000, and I think our budget was up at that time, $2 million or $3 million, much less than it is right now, as you can well imagine, because it's built from there.
And can I just ask, the general funds included Dr. Strathern's salary, all the salaries of the women?
Yeah, that's right, included the salaries of all
teaching.
all the teaching salaries and everything else. Some of the sport, of course, the intercollegiate salaries of their program, which was then in the AIAW and the Northern California Conference, as you know, which was completely separate from the Pac-10 and everything else. And one of the problems in trying to build a women's program over time, and why it took so long in my judgment, was the fact you had to get a lot of other schools building their program. Otherwise, you'd be sitting so far ahead, and you'd have nobody to play. It'd be a joke, fundamentally. So there was no NCAA, and there was the Northern California Conference, which the women's program was competing in. So I showed the budget to them, which gave them some comprehension of how we were running our program. And number two, the fact that it was a legitimate program. The university had asked that you be self-sufficient, which in a long-range sense, quite frankly, can be pretty dangerous. Even Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame has recently made a comment that saying that they have to rest on their own bottom, athletics having to rest ultimately on its own bottom, can mean some changes if you're not able to raise a hell of a lot of money. Is the university going to take from its own budget then to support things that are now really on a dollar basis? So when you build into the dollar basis, you, in a sense, have to be able to continue and go. So, but anyhow.
Could I just ask, what was their reaction when they saw a $2 to $3 million budget? Did they have any idea that men's sports needed that much money to function, and it was at that level?
Yeah, well, of course, a lot of that, was tied in also to athletic scholarships, which the women did not have. And the Buck Club was supporting that at the time, and football and basketball income was supporting almost all the other programs.
But I guess, did they have any idea the dollar amount that it took?
No.
So even Dr. Strathern was a bit surprised when she really saw the money.
She was surprised. And the salaries weren't really great in those days. I think, I think I was earning $27,000 when I took over the job, and I had been making $24,000 as an independent fundraiser. So you wouldn't say that they're overemphasizing, the salary structure at that particular day. And even when I hired Bill Walsh, it was a relatively low salary compared to everybody else in the conference. But people wanted to come, which was fine. And at the same time, I think I have to mention that we were Stanford was going through a budget problem at that time, and you were asked to cut, which was not the most propitious time to really start merging a new program, and everything else. But it worked out pretty well. In fact, I got a paper here, I'm going to leave it with you, of a letter I wrote to Ray McKetty regarding some of the conditions. And some of the things we were going to trying to merge. This was around 78, 79, so we were then in some scholarships and everything else at the time. So anyhow, after time, we finally got to I talked also at the same time. I had some, not much, but I had a few members of the Stanford Athletic Board that were a little concerned about this. And of course, the Buck Club leadership was very concerned about it because they figured that all of a sudden the money was going to be pulled immediately, out to raise a number of scholarships for women. So I knew it was going to have to take time, because in giving scholarships, at least the way they're given out now, you have to first you got to look for talent. You got to know what the talent is. You just don't give anybody who wants to show up for a sport a scholarship. So you had to be a little careful in gradually building the scholarship program. But the coaches were very helpful to me. That is, the men coaches. Dick Gould was enormous. He really had a feel for this. Peyton Jordan the same way. So I didn't run into many obstacles on our side. There may have been a few more on the women's program at that time. But I think you saw the value of it, because we would have all the staff of the women's program together when we went over the budget. So they got a feel of what we had, what I thought we might be able to do, and that we'd have to build over time.
I know I wanted to ask sort of a sociological question, because I know we're in such a different place now in 1995. But could you talk a little bit about what happened with the women with their physical education mindset?
Yeah.
And the difficulty you perceived them having in understanding what athletics was about, and that it wasn't, I always got a sense that they felt this would impede our academics at Stanford, and we couldn't train.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Pam particularly was very strong, as you well know, on the strong athletic component. A strong PE component, and to make certain that program wasn't impacted at all. And actually, I told them that we could also help, because some of the major coaches we had were outstanding teachers. You don't have to go through a PE program to be an outstanding teacher. Mm-hmm. Just like nowadays, you can find some tremendous teachers in business and everything else who could probably fit in very well with some of the things they're teaching now. But in any event, there was that concern. But I think we overcame that hurdle, and it was a gradual process. One of the ways I thought, and that I believe I was at least reasonably creative, if you want to say it that way, was that I suggested to the Stanford Athletic Board, and I can't tell you how important that board was. The volunteers on that board, the Frank Dodatos and the Tom Fords and God knows a whole group of them, were tremendously supportive during this program. But I suggested, number one, a way to overcome some of these hurdles, both from the point of view of women who might be participating as student athletes, but also the teachers and everything else in the PE program, was to, number one, start inviting women to serve on the Stanford Athletic Board, which had been totally male-dominated for many, many years, up till really about 75. So we started inviting some women who were interested in women's athletics. Shirley Kelly, of course, was there, Barbara Bruner. You had, Tony Moiso. Tony was a male. There was several others. I'll show you the list later. And so that way we had women on the board who could start putting their creativity, because they were very creative in starting to figure out how to raise money for women's athletics. You know, we were doing it, because of a long tradition. But they brought in the auctions and a whole series of other things that at least could get something off the ground and start building the program, because it took time to build a fundraising base behind it. And another thing I did was to suggest that we put a women's student athlete and a male student athlete sit on the respective boards. I tried to interchange people so you had another voice there listening to what was going on at Buck Club meetings, listening to what was going on at athletic, the Stanford Athletic Board meetings and everything else. So I think this helped, open the fact that people are trying to be open about it. You're trying to keep an open society. You're not trying to keep a closed society and hide behind closed doors fundamentally. So I think that, I'd say, was extremely helpful. Then I think you've got to credit people like Frank Lodato and particularly Frank. I'd say Frank did just simply an enormous job in assisting me in the program, and since then has done the same thing for the entire breadth of the program. And it was interesting to me that several people we had on the Stanford Athletic Board ultimately became members of the Board of Trustees. Because of the service they have provided Stanford and the breadth that they showed. Because I've always claimed, in fact, one of the things that people were concerned about was, even the university gets concerned about the fact that somehow you're raising money for a separate department like the Buck Club or the Cardinal Club. How is that going to impact gifts to the university? And I've been in fundraising long enough to know, number one, that when you look at the history of Stanford athletics and you look at the gift support, and I've been privileged to see that, the people who give to athletics, a tremendous number of them give much larger support to the university for broader programs, particularly at the higher giving level. Just tremendous. I would say at the smaller level maybe not, but at least at the higher level. So it's been, I think, a boon the way the program has operated, and probably could only have operated, I suspect, without, as long as you kept the program within the integrity of what the university demanded. And I think that was our feel. I will admit that even when I started giving women's athletic scholarships, at that time there had been no determination about where football fit in there. I started analyzing it based on the fact that you keep football out of it and you'd have balance between all other sports, and try to gerrymander and figure out where you give the scholarships if you were working toward a goal. Now, of course, they're in there, so it complicates the matter from the fundraising and everything else. I think the second thing about the entire program that was helpful was, after I retired, I think you got to give Andy Geiger and you got to give Don Kennedy and the fundraising arm of the university a tremendous boost, because they are the ones that really then built from the point of view of being able to get the program to the level that it is now. It took an awful lot of time because a lot of money was spent and the department was in straits, and the people who liked Stanford athletics, Frank and others, came up with creative ideas such as living scholarships, and the fundraising department of the university was working hand in hand with the department, looking for major support for buildings, for other programs, for endowed programs and everything else. In fact, you can get an idea here that when I left, I wrote this pamphlet. It doesn't have my name because I figured that another athletic director could use it if he wanted to. But it'll give you an idea, which I think is kind of interesting, the program offerings at the time. But then to give people who had supported the athletic program some conception of what that program had done by way of different types of facilities and other programs here at the university. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
This is all the the physical education, the athletics.
Yeah,
the
well, you'll
teaching.
see Robley was built with athletic department funds. You'll see a whole series of things of the golf course,
Right.
you know, and, because the way the department is set up, which I don't think I explained, was fundamentally you are responsible for all intercollegiate athletics. We took over all the intramural program at that particular time. We had the intramural program.
Yeah.
As handsome as I was.
You're the dashiness.
I have to zoom back in again, but no, you look fine.
I forget where I left off.
You were talking about how the money from
Oh, yeah,
athletics
and,
built.
yeah. And then we had the operation and maintenance of the entire athletic plant, which is everything that was on the men's side of the area. The women's were being supported by general funds of the university. That is the maintenance of their limited grounds. If you'll notice, it was pretty limited. Another thing that I think, which historically was kind of interesting, it was not only a matter of merging the men and women's athletic departments that the goal was, but you were facing questions from staff and faculty for the use of facilities. And I remember you used to get, you know, we had the men's pool, and it had that great big high wall around it, and only the men could swim there at noon, as you will know. And a lot of faculty would use it.
You want to explain why on
A lot of faculty would use it, and they had a group of men out there that would go out and they'd be naked, you know, they'd lay in the sun to get suntans all over, I guess. So anyhow, I wanted to open the pool to the staff, faculty staff, and others, because the women had a small pool, and here we had this great big facility over there. So I went around and thought, well, the best way is to talk to some of those who were most vehement against it. And there were, not everybody was against it, but there were some very interesting faculty, one from Hoover Institution, an old economist, and there was a young chap from philosophy, and then there was the head of the, I think the dean of graduate education or something. So I thought I'd sit down with him and kind of explain rationally what sense it made. Here you had a small facility over here you had a nice big pool. All you had was a wall around it. We'd have to gerrymander some places for women to dress and everything else. I had a heck of a time really trying to sell him on that idea. So what we did, and we had decided earlier anyhow that pool was going to be eliminated because we did then have the new pool anyhow. So what we did was tear down the wall, and even then, excuse me, even then, some of the men were still trying to do that. I finally found a small spot where they could lay in a kind of a archway going back into Encina Gym, where if they wanted to lay out in the sun, they could lay there. They were kind of protected from anybody else. But the gals had to pass them where they were going. So I think there was a mention in the paper about it, but fortunately it never hit the paper to where it was one of those things. I was trying to avoid any controversy of thinking things were going to pop, you know, at Stanford, all sorts of other things. But finally it worked out very well. And then we did ultimately, as you know, destroy the pool because the operation and maintenance of the pool was a very heavy burden at the time.
It was 1930s, or it was before then, when
Yeah.
it was built.
Yeah,
It was very
yeah.
old.
And there were really severe problems with the plumbing system underneath and a whole series of other things. So we filled it in, you know, and took that out of our budget to save money, fundamentally to save money.
Because I know there was a battle before that in that if women wanted to run at Angel Field, they had to dress at Robley.
That's right.
Because I was on Caper when that was being done. Now, were you involved in recreating the dressing room in Encina Hall for women?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
was that hard to also get accomplished?
Well, that's where but we got that over, I think, fairly well. There was some grumbling, but you know, you let that roll off your back. The people who grumble ultimately are people who are the most vocal usually, but don't do a hell of a lot, for you anyhow. And I don't think it was a dramatic thing I was doing, opening it up for women. I thought it was a thing to do, you know, and but some people, I guess, carry things a little longer than other people do and everything else. So fundamentally, and then, as I say, the fundraising from the point of view of the university from there on in, and Don Kennedy's participation and feel for athletics, I think I just carried that thing to heights. I had the opportunity, I think, during that period. One thing I did do, I asked several of our coaches, male coaches, because I knew very little about women's athletics, and I asked them to check with their colleagues around the country about quality women coaches that I might, from the point of view of initial hiring. I think Dottie McRae in basketball, Dick DeBizo had been down with the UCLA coach, I forget her name right now, wonderful gal. And she recommended several people for Dick to interview, which he did, and then I interviewed, of course. And Dick Gould, of course, we had Ann Gould, took it over, but Ann really wanted to stay in teaching, as you probably know, a wonderful, wonderful teacher, a wonderful human being. So they helped considerably, and then when we appointed Sadao Hamada to gymnastics, and Sadao was then able to, and he is tremendous in gymnastics. As you know, I guess he won again, didn't he, this year? I think they beat Nebraska, if I'm not mistaken, as a team. And he was very, very active in helping. And but there have been some great women appointments, I think, in recent years. There's no doubt about it. It's a program that, the one thing that we had an advantage of, and I think you're finding it now, we had a tremendous advantage early because we, in a sense, were pretty far ahead of everybody else in terms of scholarships and everything else, even in the conference. But that's because they're catching up now. Since it's broadening to other programs, it'll give a little bit more competition and a whole series of other things. One thing you might not know is that, and I still bear the feeling that's the way it should be, but it's because I'm an old-time athlete rather than one of the new modern ones. When I went to Notre Dame, I was in a sense a walk-on in my first year, and then the coach told me when I first came in, he said, "Well, you could pay your way through. We'll see if you can see if you're all right at the end of the first year. Maybe we can give you some help later." Well, the help was fundamentally tuition, which at those days was $400 or something like that. So I played at Notre Dame, and we were just as competitive as I guess anybody else at the time. But during my tenure, I did fight, which some of the athletes would probably disagree with. I fought for a modified need formula in athletic scholarships. Not a need formula, because take the amount of time they were putting in. If you compared them, say, to a student who was asked to work to partly pay his way through, the athletic experience was the work component, let's say. And I figured, because I knew there'd be problems if trying to do it with a lot of schools that are state schools as well as private schools, that the tuition be what you might call the grant. And then after that, a need formula would apply to board and room. Well, I fought it for 2 years and was knocked down all over the place at the NCAA. I finally brought in Dick Lyman, and we lost, as Dick told me the other day. Well, we lost, we didn't win, but we lost only by, I think, about 16 votes out of about 1,000 people voting, because Dick was talking to the presidents, at the same time and everything else. In retrospect, I'm not sure. I got worried then that people were thinking I was anti-athletic. You got to be very careful when you deal with this particular problem. Hell, I was for athletics because I figured, my God, I wouldn't have been doing what I was doing if I wasn't for them. But anyhow, I think that's a long foregone thing unless people run into real problems.
It's now coming back.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if it does. I wouldn't be surprised if it does.
Can you talk a little bit about President Lyman's influence in getting the presidents organized?
Oh yeah, in fact, John Harbaugh and I talked to Dick at length and started to get him really involved in attending NCAA meetings. And at that time, he was instrumental also in starting to get that President's Consortium, which is now, in a sense, a very strong component of the NCAA decision-making body, which I thought was absolutely essential. And Dick was a leader, or really fundamentally a leader in that. I had recommended to the NCAA in a memo, and I thought I had a copy, but I don't, and I'd have to get it from the NCAA if they stayed their files at all, a letter recommending one of the things that ought to be looked at from the point of view of judging athletic programs would be the graduation rate of athletes. Now, we're strong on that here, as you know, Notre Dame's strong on it and everything else. But I suggested that they do it over all sports, and that it would be, I didn't suggest they publish the information. Now they're publishing it naturally, but at that time I didn't want to get everybody all concerned. But that it be given them to their boards of trustees to get some understanding of the numbers of kids in athletics that were graduating, the numbers that weren't. And you would compare people, say you took in junior college athletes, you wouldn't compare them with the 4-year freshmen, you'd compare them with other junior college students that came in at the same time compared to graduation rate. It's a little hard to do for small sports when you have a limited number. For big sports like football, it's probably more realistic. You don't have a broad enough, you could lump all your other sports into kind of or several of them into components and then maybe make a statistical survey. But it seemed to me that was a logical way to do it. Well, the NCAA did start something on that. They asked, they invited schools to be willing to do it voluntarily. And using the what is that other, not SAT, but the other one.
ACT.
ACT, the ACT program. Well, I think that lasted 1 year and everybody dropped out. found out it wasn't very productive in looking at the figures. But they're getting more and more to that now, and I think the emphasis is really, really helpful. Because it had always seemed to me that as much as I love athletics, it's still hard for me to accept that somehow you can get a completely full ride if you're J. Paul Getty's son and a great athlete going to a university, and some other kid who might have an opportunity wouldn't and have real need couldn't do it. But that's a philosophical point of view. I admit at odds with a lot of people, I'm sure, on that. But that's neither here nor there.
Could you speak to the need why you and John Harbaugh, who was the NC2A rep at that time, he's in Colorado till the end of June, why you and he approached, what was happening that you felt the presidents needed to take an active role in the NC2A?
Well, number one, it was basically from the point of view, I think, of the scholarship program. Second, all universities were going to face a need for increase in funding for those particular programs. And third was to maintain really more of the academic integrity. That was my whole goal. I don't care if a school has 25% of all the students graduate and 25% of their football team graduates. That's neither here nor there, because they're playing with a representative sample of their student body. That's the way I looked at it. And so it was fundamentally for that reason that I was really trying to get Dick involved, because I felt it was very essential, because if things got out of hand, we'd be in a real tough situation, as hard as we were trying. So, and Dick was enormous at this. He's quite a leader, I'll tell you. I did have a interesting experience though at one of the NCAA conventions. I'm Notre Dame graduate, as you know, and Father Joyce, who was the executive vice president of Notre Dame, was a representative from Notre Dame at the convention also. And there was an argument over our proposal for a need formula that was on the floor at the time. And Father Joyce did a McCarthyism, which he apologized for, but I'll tell that about it. He got up on the floor and made a statement saying that in 1953, I think it was 53, that an article in the Saturday Evening Post or something stated that Ronnie Knox, who was then one of the athletes that was a high school athlete that had gone to UCLA, then to Cal, and some other place, had stated that Chuck Taylor had offered him $50 to come to Stanford. Which is a pretty brutal. I have never been so furious in my life, but I got a kind of a cold feeling over me, at that accusation, because I know Chuck Taylor. Probably more integrity in that man than any coach I've ever been around. And at the same time, I was running the work program here for athletes at Stanford, because you had to work your way through in those days. You didn't get a full ride, Some kids had jobs downtown after the season, this, that, and the other. They make sure that we were honest on that, and Wally Sterling had a survey, we had our own lawyers looking at it and everything else. So I got up and I said, it's in front of, it was a pretty big crowd, about 1,000 people, and I said, it's kind of strange that two Notre Dame graduates should be at opposite ends of the spectrum. I said, what he has said about what Father Joyce doesn't know is that I was in charge of the job program at Stanford at that particular time, and I've known Chuck Taylor for a number of years, and I don't know of anybody with more integrity. And I said I had the opportunity to sit in on an interview with Ronnie Knox when he and his father came to visit us, and I said we'd ask Ronnie a question and his father would answer. I said we wouldn't touch Ronnie Knox with a 10-foot pole. I was fuming. I was ready to sputter, and so Father got up and he said, I want to apologize, And I got up and I turned around, I says, Father, I'll pray for you. It brought down the house. It brought down the house. It was really funny. It was classic, I'll tell you, but I had to laugh. But it's probably in the minutes there someplace anyhow. But it was an interesting thing to go through.
Now back a little bit. I know that when we were coming out in 73, 74 with issues about women's athlete and Title IX had been passed, there was a quote in the Daily. Somebody wrote letters to the editor and alum, and he said if a woman got 1 penny of his money, he would never contribute to the Buck Club again. Now I ask you this because do you want to start about the Buck and the Cardinal Club, and then how later on you were able to merge them?
Well, I didn't merge them. I tried to. See,
okay.
I tried very hard to merge them, but there was considerable resistance, let's put it that way, gentle resistance.
So when did the Cardinal Club start? Do you remember?
Cardinal Club started, I think, about 98, just about the time
78?
I left.
Oh,
Yeah, in
78.
fact, I've got here,
Oh, okay.
here's the 78, 79, Peg Feld, Linda Meyer was on there, and she ended up being a board member of the Stanford Athletic Board. Nancy Dietz, this was the,
So it just got off the ground then towards the end of your tenure?
That's right. I had people attending Stanford Athletic Board meeting, women on the athletic board at that time from about 95 on, until we got some sense of whether we needed a separate organization and everything else. So the athletic board, in a sense, became the kind of the focal point for working both groups, the Buck Club and the Cardinal Club, until Andy finally was able to get them merged. And you know how long that took. The fight going on that was something else. We'd almost had to do it by fiat. I was never a great believer in trying to force something very early, particularly in a situation that hadn't yet gotten off the ground. I think sometimes when you've got your strength enough, then you can step in like you're Caesar or somebody and say it's going to be this way, and the hell with you guys,
So did he came on board in 78 then, or 79? Andy Geiger came on board.
Yeah, he came on board in 79.
And when do you think he accomplished this merger? In the 80s, mid-80s?
Yeah, it was in the mid-80s. It wasn't too long before he retired. Maybe a couple years before he retired. I forget the dates.
So this could be less than 10 years old then?
Oh, yeah.
It's been merged.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah.
And could you explain a living scholarship? I don't know.
Well, Frank Lodato had that idea, which was a wonderful idea. Volunteers come up with the most creative of all ideas. Fundraisers don't. All they do is try to say, geez, it's a great idea, and I'll have to implement that. But he thought that there was a possibility, because the tuition was going up so rapidly, that we might be able to intrigue people into giving what they call living scholarships. And a living scholarship was fundamentally a gift of tuition. Again, not boardroom and tuition, but a gift of tuition. Now you get boardroom and tuition. I strongly recommend in that one article, if you read that, was that after I left, there was going to have to be a strong emphasis on building an endowed base, and that has really started to take off. You got endowed coaching salaries in a sense, so you've got a fundamental base underneath the whole program. And indeed, it's going to be, I think, very important, because if the university really feels that it doesn't want to put its general funds money into athletics, you're going to have sufficient funds to be able to sustain the program. So that's been a big part of the program, I think, since it was going on while we were there, and even while Chuck was there, we were getting endowed scholarship, but not at the same level, because the tuition was rising and it's more money every time you do that.
So for instance, an endowed scholarship might be $1 million.
Yeah, that's right.
And that scholarship then is in perpetuity. It will give an
That's right. All the income is used, but it takes an awful lot of income. I tried to figure out one time you'd have to have a $250 million endowment to be able to subsidize everything you're doing right now, including maintenance and everything else. So you're talking about big money if you're trying to endow everything.
So a living is that person gives a check to Stanford for $25,000 a year?
A year. It's an annual gift, so you're never really sure. Fundamentally, if the chap dies, of course, it goes out of existence. So you're never sure it's going to be continuing. If it happens to be somebody who thinks, boy, they got a great program and they lose next year, and he decides not to give it, you got that problem too, So although very few people drop that, I have learned that those that complain fundamentally about an athletic program here at Stanford, particularly, people are always up in arms with the coach or this, that. You generally can count them on the fingers of one hand, or two hands maybe. I've been involved in fundraising long enough to know, as I've been down in Southern California, for 7 years, and 7 years all the way from Pittsburgh to Denver to Canada to Mexico, dealing with different alumni groups. There's a strong feeling for the integrity of Stanford's athletic program, and you're not going to have people just all of a sudden jump off the bandwagon. You'll find some, but you can handle it. It's one of those things. You suffer a few slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. But it was, I think it was the most exhilarating experience of my life, quite frankly. I had never expected, because I had never had any background in dealing with a large budget and handling other people aside from a football staff one time at St. Mary's. So all of a sudden I'm thrown into a budget of $3 million with 146 people that you're responsible for and everything else. Had never seen the budget before. And so I took the first year, and the first year I made very few decisions. I figured I better learn what I'm doing before I start wandering off the deep end. At the same time, I also wanted to check out the nature of athletics around the country in different types of institutions. So after the first football season, I took off with Jenny, and I went to Nebraska. Notre Dame I knew about, Penn State, Yale, Harvard, Texas, let's see.
This would have been 72, 73.
This would have been 72, 73, yeah. And talked with their athletic directors and their coaches to get a sense of how they were looking at athletics, how they were looking at the women's programs, and also to test out my idea of a need formula in athletic scholarships, which went over like a lead balloon with most of them. But in any event, they were honest with it, and everything else. And had some wonderful meetings, but it gave me a sense, of how things were working around the country, and it enabled me then to know other athletic directors to whom I could call with regard for confidence and everything else, or for information on people and everything else. Later on, I also made a survey of the country from the point of view of affirmative action. Took off and traveled and visited a lot of coaches around the country to ask their recommendations regarding people that we might consider in case a vacancy ever opened up, that where a minority would have an opportunity to apply and be considered. And I asked our own coaching staff to do the same thing, to identify people, for the benefit of the program. And so it was an interesting experience, and I didn't get too much out of that. People tend to go, when you're talking to coaches, tend to go to their own people. It's still fair, and I presume it takes place with women too. If they have a women's program, they'll go to other women. It's not going to be sex restricted in that sense either, So, but it was helpful to me because I know Bill Walsh did a great job of bringing in Denny Green and several others, because we talked about minority hiring when I hired Bill, and I don't know if you're interested in anecdotes, but I remember when I hired Bill the first time, after he had accepted the salary level, which wasn't very much, quite frankly, compared to, I think he took a $12,000 cut to come to Stanford from his pool job. He said, "Do you remember the last time you met me?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember you with John Ralston, No. He said, "You tried to recruit me out of high school when you were coaching at St. Mary's College." His memory is pretty phenomenal. Mine isn't quite that good,
Can you explain, because Ted Leland called you coach, so yeah. Ted was an assistant football coach under you in some capacity?
No, not under me. No, Bill, he was taking graduate work here at Stanford in the School of Education at the time, and Bill Walsh hired him as a student assistant. Okay. So he was with Bill.
Okay. But you coached under which football coach then? Here at Stanford, you were a football coach.
Chuck Taylor.
Chuck Taylor. So you were an assistant under coach.
Oh yeah. I was assistant coach with Chuck Taylor. Yeah. Okay. And that was interesting.
Now, one of the things I'm struck by is, I was just pounding on your door demanding equality all the time in those days.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm struck by, and it first came when you came to the class and Sally mentioned some of the contributions you've made, is I've never heard of other male athletic directors going around the country to assess other programs. You did a lot of creative work in going out to see what was out there.
Mm-hmm.
And did anybody visit us, or were you really sort of, your development background gave you this creativity to go and find out?
Yeah, well, when you go into something where you've never had any background in it, I think at least it was common sense, it seemed to me, to try to figure out what's going on and start introducing myself around. Because a lot of people that transfer from one school to another have known a whole circle of people, and I have been about only basically in fundraising for 15 years. And while I knew an awful lot of Stanford alumni, both men and women, around the whole entire country, from the point of view of the athletic program, I knew maybe the USC coaches and the UCLA people, but that was about it.
Mm-hmm.
So even the Washington coaches I didn't know at the time. So it was a matter of making certain I didn't stumble and create havoc. The first year I was as head of the program, but it was a fascinating experience. I'm going to let you have this too.
We can make copies and bring and give you back.
That's
the
fine,
copies.
yeah. And then
Thank
this
you.
you might be interested in is a list of all the people that have served on the Stanford Athletic Board over the
Oh.
years.
Thank
That's
you
up
very much.
through about 79. And you'll start seeing women's names in there which weren't in before 72, quite frankly, and that I know of.
When the one thing I know, John Harbaugh is away, but this may have happened after your tenure.
Yeah.
He told me about the vote at the NCAA to host Division III women's events one year, and then the next year to host Division I and II events. Was that after you had retired in
After I
Geiger?
retired, yeah, after I retired, yeah.
Okay.
In fact, they weren't even, there wasn't even an NCAA program when I retired. See, they were still in the AIAW. That was one of the problems, Northern California Conference. I think we had started, I'd have to go back in memory, I think we had started some of the Pac-10 schools had started, and we started getting that thing going, but there still wasn't a Pac-10, which you might call conference for women, in any of the sports. So that came later.
Now I remember, I think it was 75, and I was in talking to you, and the women's field hockey team had just made the national championships, and they were ecstatic. And that was the first time I understood that the NCAA paid Athletes Way,
That's
whereas AIAW you had to pay. Could you
Yeah.
talk a little about the difference in the rules, and as an administrator you were administrating two different programs?
Oh, yeah, and Pam and I, Pam knew that program pretty well, because see, when we merged, I hired Pam, or brought Pam in as an associate athletic director under me, because she knew the women's programs and everything else. So she would handle that, although I would attend the AIAW meetings with Pam, and she would attend the NCAA meetings with me, because that way you get to learn the politics of both bodies, quite frankly. And I think it was very helpful for both of us to do that. And I think John Harbaugh even went with her on a couple of those, if I remember, get some idea. But they were two different types of programs, and I can't really give you too much of the difference. I know NCAA, generally a lot of the things weren't getting paid before the NCAA came in, even when we were going to NCAA tournaments.
Oh.
You'd get some return from the gate receipts, but a lot of the expenses were paid. Had to be paid by yourself.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, even when we went to the Bluebonnet Bowl and to the Sun Bowl in football, I think we reaped out of that about, in fact, I got the budgets of both of them in there. I think we reaped about $1,000. So it was a great experience for the kids to have a chance to go someplace, but we didn't lose money. You didn't get that type of income like you get from the Rose Bowl, where it's split up among all 10 conferences. And also, we got the $1,000. If we'd have reaped all that ourselves, we would have had, let's see, we'd had 10,000. Because what happens is you split any gate receipts of major bowl games with all the schools in the conference. So that helps support the schools that are having some difficulty and everything else. Share the wealth program. It's known as a communist program.
In the old days, I remember if we were in the Rose Bowl, we got 60% of the gates, and the rest of the 40 was distributed
that's
with
it.
the Pac-8.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that's only Rose Bowl specifically.
That's Rose Bowl, yeah. And the other programs, you would get one extra. Which if you divided the amount, you get one extra other than the other, and then they reduce theirs. The figures are beyond me now. I've kind of forgotten that I'm now into molecular biology, so I'm trying to figure out other things.
When you look back, do you think then that part of the reason why you were chosen for this is you weren't coming from the straight football coach for X number of years, athletic director?
I don't know why I was, quite frankly, to be honest with you. I presume fundraising had a part, but they probably could foresee that fundraising was going to play a role in this. That may have been the reason. I guess they figured I'd be able to handle it, which I wasn't sure of at the time, but I guess it worked out all right. So now I've been at Stanford, let's see, since '51, so I've been here 44 years. It's a long time. So I do know an awful lot of people. And I think one of the other strengths of the program, and this applies to both men and women's programs, is the tremendous faculty support the program has had over the years. There are always some who will think, athletics shouldn't play a part. Because, see, I attended the University of Chicago when Bob Hutchings was there. And I was the only football player on campus. I was playing professional football with Chicago Rockets. So they called me Homo Footballiensis. A guy named Shapley who wrote an article for what they call the Pulse magazine. Had something Homo Footballiensis, and but it was kind of interesting because it was quite a university in those days. This was after the war, and I was back taking graduate work in anthropology, and kind of enjoyed it a little bit.
And so you're playing pro football on the weekends and doing your
Well, I
master's
was going
degree.
to school and then attending practice in morning when I was able to, for that year.
And that year it was offense and defense, the same team? Or you were still playing both sides, right, with the leather football?
Oh yeah, leather helmets, yeah. Oh gosh, yes, yeah. Yeah, I played in the old days where it was, you played both offense and defense, and there's a lot of times you played 60 minutes. One year at Notre Dame, Elmer Layton had what he called two first teams, so he'd substitute those as full teams, but you couldn't substitute individually to a lot unless somebody was injured or something like that. So there were a lot of rule changes that have gone on since then,
Because one of the theories is that if football, I know it was, you could have 120, I remember, suited up on the bench for a home game, you could only travel with 95 or whatever, and now I think it's going down to 85 full rides.
Right. Yeah.
What are your thoughts if every college team was down to 47 full rides, like a pro roster has 47 guys on the team, and you've still got your room for walk-ons, you've still got room for other people that want to play, but if football was down to 47, then all the other men's teams wouldn't be upset that the women's teams have more scholarships in the quote minor sports.
Yeah.
And do you think that would really hurt pro football? Because only 0.3% make it to the combine. This is a thought of how to solve this problem.
Oh yeah, in fact, I've long felt personally that coaches will probably disagree with me because everybody wants more and more, that you could get a program down to about 66. I think because of the injury factor and the contact nature of that sport, I think you've got to take that into consideration and say it's a different type of program than almost any other that's involved. Hockey, of course, but you protect it a little bit more, I think, in hockey than you are in football, from knee injuries and a whole series of other things with the blocking and everything else. But that was one thing. We voted for all the decreases in football scholarships. Notre Dame did the same thing. They felt the same way we did. And we also voted for not to have freshmen participate in varsity sports. That was one of the feelings I felt, that from the point of view, let them get acquainted with the university first. It's the way I was brought up, so I guess you go back to your roots when you start making decisions a lot of times. But I still believe that's good, and Notre Dame was strongly in favor of that.
Because I know that was still in effect in '68, but I think '69 they let freshmen participate. Yeah. So I don't know when they were trying to reverse it then again.
We were trying to reverse it when we were there, but it was voted down generally by NCAA. Vote at the NCAA. So now, is there anything else I can
And Jennifer knows a lot of the legislative history. Are there some issues with?
Yeah.
I guess one of the things that I haven't is the compliance, because I'm reading Jennifer's paper. What happened is, the rules, it was passed, and then there were guidelines, and then as long as you could show you were making progress, I guess you were okay. Now,
Yeah.
now I know Sally Mahoney was a compliance officer for a while. Was she the first one?
Yeah. Yeah. Sally followed us through that. Yeah.
Okay. And so was there a time when you felt Stanford perhaps wasn't making adequate progress towards equality? Did they ever?
I don't think we were ever questioned on that, to be honest with you. I know I was concerned we weren't making fast enough progress, but that was a dollar problem more than almost anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you read that memo to Ray Bicchetti, you'll see some things in there of how you had to view it, how I was viewing it at the time, and where I said we haven't yet satisfied our own requirements, much less the government's. So I knew about it, but I don't know what option you'd have had. I'm trying to figure out what somebody else might have done in my place that was very strongly in favor of athletics and said, God dang it, we're going to do this blah. We're going to take all the Buck Club money now that we have in reserve, which was always set there for the following year to make sure you had something to cover a scholarship, and which was not assured of renewal every year. And we're going to start giving out to women's athletics. Well, it might have lasted a year, and then nobody would have a scholarship. So fundamentally you're faced with a dollar problem, and you do as much as you can. That's the reason it was so important to get women involved on the athletic board, it seemed to me, and get volunteer leadership that was going to help, because the volunteers are the ones that are going to raise the money for you. It's very seldom that a staff person raises the money. Now, you might be influential and gain the respect of an awful lot of donors, but it's usually a volunteer that actually makes the ask and is able to really effectively do something. And so I wasn't satisfied with it, but as I say, I think we did about as much as we could have at that particular time, as I viewed it. I wish I had all my documentation so I could go through this for you in detail, but I don't. But you're welcome to look at anything I do have at any time.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, regarding Title IX, was it very clear passing down from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare? Was it clear what steps were necessary to start implementing women's
I don't think there
athletics?
were. I think that's part of the problem. I really don't think there were that. They didn't say put a guideline on the end of 2 this year, 5, 10. You got to build it up. It was a very amorphous type of thing, which allowed you to either be dilatory or to move as fast as you could if you had the dollars to do it. No, the guidelines were just generalizations. You were working in a sense in the dark with regard to how they were ultimately really reviewing this thing. What the end result was going to be, whether they were going to include football, whether they're not going to include football. You had no way of knowing, fundamentally. So you started looking. That's the reason I started looking for equity, at least with other sports, rather than just not including football, quite frankly, at the time. And now you do. So.
Did you initially start creating new women's teams, or was there the club sports that were
Well,
already?
the club sports were, I think they're, let me look at this and see if there's any time we ended that were new. Maybe you can check me because.
See, in '72 there was basketball, swimming, field hockey, tennis, volleyball was just getting off the
Gymnastics,
ground.
I don't think you had gymnastics, did you?
We had it in '69, and then the coach quit. So from
Oh, that's right,
'69.
the gal chat, that's true, we hired after that, that's when I got them out, yeah. Golf was there, field hockey was there, fencing was there, but it wasn't an intercollegiate sport at the time. Cross country, I'm not sure if cross country was.
Track, also Heidi Klaus was the gymnastics and the track coach, and she retired in '69.
Yeah.
And so there was no track and field
I
after
think
that.
that was one that was added
Peyton Jordan,
in
you
there,
added. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was one that was added in there. Volleyball was in there. I initiated the volleyball program. I remember that. It seemed to me that was a sport that was ideal for promoting Olympic sport. You looked for Olympic sports, and you also had to look fundamentally, are these sports being played at the high school level, you know, what sports are they having at the high school level where you can identify talent? You know, if you don't do that, you know, you're working in the dark. And so, yeah, there's at least two of them in there that probably we revived, yeah. But, you know, you had a wonderful tennis program, the women's program. Curly Neal was, you know, superb coach. Swimming and diving, we had, in fact, in history, I guess, if you look over the history, there were some great women athletes in the past. If you look at Don Liebendorfer's book, Color of Life is Red, you'll find that to be interesting. Incidentally speaking, if you're interested in a joke, I don't know if you want this on television, but not a bad joke. It's about the Russian water polo team. I don't know if I told you about that. We arranged a water polo match with Russia, and we invited them over first, and it was the so-called team from the University of Moscow. And so they came over first, and so we were having the meet held here, and then we were going to send them down to LA where they were going to meet USC and UCLA and then fly on back, and then we go over the next year. So when we were having the match here at Stanford, we had the Stanford band come in, and they, you know, the Russians exchanged gifts and everything else, but the band got there and they started playing first the national anthem, our national anthem. Then they played the Russian national anthem. And then they all put down their instruments and stood up and said, "You may have the best water polo team, but we've got your submarine." Now, if you remember the submarine that was off the coast, you know, I thought I would die. Dick Lyman and I were sitting there, and I cringed, you know. I didn't know, of course, I don't know if any of them spoke English, but it was really something else again.
Well, you know, now that game, I have to tell you, because what happened was, I don't know if you remember, but we had Vicki Hayes and Kathy Levinson and Eva Gurn, I'm trying to remember the fourth tennis player, on the steering committee of Organization of Stanford Women Athletes. Yeah. And we went to you and said, you know, the situation at Daguerre just isn't working because there's the general women's room, the general men's, the men's locker room, and the men's team locker room. Now, can you talk a little bit about getting the men's visiting team locker room changed into the women's team locker room?
Yeah, and my memory, I know I worked on it, but my memory fades me on that, to be quite honest with you. And I don't want to make any false statements or take credit for something I didn't do. You know,
well, no, you did implement it when we pointed it out to you.
I understand I implemented it. Yeah, I remember that, but I don't remember the details.
Because I'll tell you, Gorin and Lambert got me in a room.
Oh yeah, Lambert. Oh yeah.
And for half an hour, they let me have it quite royally.
Oh really?
And their biggest issue was, where will the Russian men's volleyball team, water polo team dress if we let the women's team have that locker room? And I said, well,
really?
you know, they're bringing their bathing suits and their towels wet with them twice a day to work out, which is ridiculous. Yeah. And I said, and if you're nice to them and ask, they might just let you have it that winter. Sure. But they were just absolutely incensed that visiting locker room had been taken over by the women's team. Yeah. And I guess part of this history goes, I think you told me that Daguerre was supposed to be completed in like *69 and then the riots hit. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the money and then the withdrawal and the roof that was supposed to be there?
Yeah, it actually was originally built to be in you know, a completely enclosed space, and at the time, as I say, we were in budget problems and everything else. And I guess I made the decision to leave it open and not to do that because it would have meant air conditioning, and a lot of extra expenses would have had to go in if you put a roof over something. In order to, maintenance costs would have risen, and you'd have to look at your budget now and say, we're going to be able to do this, because people generally don't give for maintenance. You know, trying to get somebody to give you for the basic support of the university or the general support is a hard thing to do. And you take it out of your own general unrestricted gifts is fundamentally what you do. And some people don't like that. You know, they want to give just specifically for this. But I think the decision I made the decision on that. I made a decision that we weren't going to move ahead with the. Well, I also made a decision that we'd open up the handball, the restroom at the handball courts to both men and women, where you could put, you know, a sign, turn it around and do this, that, and the other thing. And you know, Amy Blue, her name is, she was a vice president here at the university, originally from MIT, and was a cheerleader there, amazingly enough. And by cheerleader, you wonder who she was cheering for, I guess, if you want to, because she told me that one time. She's now dead, she died.
Oh.
They got some sort of a memorial for her. But she told us she went in there one day to take a shower, because she had, you know, in comes some guy naked and just goes in and takes a shower right next to her and walks out. So
So I guess the reason why I asked about the delay is, when you think back with 1995, you have a hard time understanding how a brand new complex of this nature could be built in 74 and not have women's facilities, or not think that
That's
women
right.
would play racquetball.
mm,
So I guess where the plans that were drawn up in 69, nobody thought to look at them and make
No.
changes.
well, see, this was underway even before I took over.
Mhm.
And I didn't even consider at that time, until the issue came up, you know, about the fact that there was only, you know, one restroom in there for both men and women. Wasn't even open at that time, or was apparently intended not to be open to women also. But that's when we opened up right away. I mean, yeah,
Right.
that was-
But I guess it's hard to understand how something that new could be built in 74, and people didn't think that there might be,
yeah,
that it just wasn't part of the consciousness then of the era.
no. In fact, it was built when I think it was on its way, or pretty well along, when I first came aboard. In fact, I think I was helping raise money for that, as well as Maples Pavilion, in addition to other things I was doing for Earth Sciences and a few other schools that I used to raise money for. But that one kind of escapes me now, as to just all the details that went on at that particular time.
Because I
It's
remember
one of
all
the problems with oral history.
that it's.
When you get to be somebody's age,
Yeah,
things come up unexpectedly.
I should have done this 20 years
Oh,
ago.
that's right, yeah.
Now I remember, I think it was 74 or 75, when you one time took out plans and showed the plans to me, because a big problem then was people sneaking into facilities who weren't Stanford people, and Stanford would be liable if they got hurt, or people
Mm.
climbing over the swimming pool. And you showed me the plans for the AIAW Center, and that there was everyone would have to show their ID card to get to the pool, to get to the tennis, and get to Maples, and that was the grand scheme. So in 1975, you showed me where this brand new athletic administration building was going to sit.
No, I don't think I
You
did.
don't think?
No, I don't think I was involved in that. In fact, it's a magnificent building.
Well, it wasn't the AIAW Center per se, but
Yeah.
I think you showed me that this was the field where.
Oh, yeah.
new
I figured
athletic
that
building.
this probably would have been a site, yeah, but
Mhm.
it had none of the beautiful comprehension of what's going on there
Right,
now.
but I think
Yeah,
the
that's a
plans-
magnificent
The
ins-
plans were that that's where you were going to
Yeah,
move.
yeah. Fundamentally, that was it. Tie them all together,
Mhm.
you know, because we were kind of disparate all over
Right.
the campus, and so.
Because I just always marveled at why it took almost 20 years then to get that built.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, number one, they had to keep your programs going, number one, and John Ariaga is a wonderful guy. He was on our athletic board too, and tremendous guy, a very close friend of Howie Dalmar, which is
Oh.
one reason it's called the Dalmar Court.
He was a basketball coach.
Yeah, he was a basketball coach here, and also the head of the intramural program for
Mhm.
years. And John and he had played together in the old days, yeah. And I was delighted they put Howie's name there, because if anybody is a coach who had been here for as many years as he had deserved it, he deserved his name someplace, you know.
Jennifer, do you have more questions?
Well, it's just kind of interesting to hear about kind of some of the initial proceedings that went on, and I kind of get a feeling that the faculty support was high, or that you had.
Oh, yeah,
favorable
the faculty support. I've, aside from those interviews I had with a few people, you know, where I had to I was trying to use the Socratic method of drawing them out, you know. Not sure if it worked, but they were still vehement against doing it, almost as if they were taking some liberty that Stanford had given them when they first became members of the faculty, that should be there forever, you know. And I had to kind of ultimately didn't persuade them. I just went ahead and did it, you know. But at least I went through the process
right.
of saying I'm interested in finding out why you don't like it, you know, which is, I think, important to listen to other people.
And in all fairness, the women had a deck that's long been closed on Robley, where you could go up on the roof of Robley
Yeah.
and
They never
not
told me
be
about
seen.
that. You'd have probably found some men trying to invade the premises.
Except the splinters were so bad, if you rolled over without your towel.
Yeah.
But I guess the other question that I have is, in doing this project, the Block S project, and talking to a lot of other women who weren't involved in Organization of Stanford Women Athletes, like volleyball for some reason was fighting its own battle separately. The Dr. Strathern had a lot of very militant, feminist young athletes coming in her office all the time and demanding. And in fact, Kathy Thaxton told me yesterday that when she was named to the Olympic team and when she came to Stanford, Dr. Strathern called her in and said, the women's rowing program is not going to last here. If you want to be an Olympic rower, I suggest you find another university.
Yeah.
And that was
was that while she was with me or before?
That was before.
I was going to say
That was before. That was 75, because she was in the 76 games.
Yeah.
And so I know that as a graduate student, when I was working for Bob Murphy in SID, and your secretary used to let me have time with you all the time, and I kept thinking,
Ruth was a great gal.
yeah, Ruth was great,
Ruth
but
was a wonderful
you know,
woman.
you had an open door policy. You never once not had an appointment with me, and I know I was extremely vehement about many issues. And
Oh, I don't remember you being vehement. I remember that.
but were there other women besides me coming and pounding and asking for this and asking for that? And so you got a sense then that the women athletes had a very different vision than the women physical educators about what needed to
very
be.
much so. Oh yeah, very much so. I think people who are skilled, Sally Ride was, I don't think Sally was in to see me or anything, but I think I understand she was pretty upset about, about the fact that we weren't able to do a lot of the things as the women's program. I will say this, after Pam became an associate athletic director of Norway, she would fight with me like mad to get preference for building the program. She was always a positive. I'm being honest about it. She really was. She could see Title IX was moving, and somehow you had to do something to protect the university and as well as your own department. And I was doing it up because I believe we ought to do it, which is a better way of doing it, quite frankly. But I wasn't too worried about Title IX at the time. I just wanted to make sure we did it and did it right.
Yeah, I was amazed at her. It was almost a 180-degree stance that she's taken, and we did become friends at the end when I got my first coaching job. And now I'm struck by the fact that she would always say to me, if we emulate the men's program, we will take all the bad along with the good, and we don't want to have it be big business and hired mercenaries.
Yeah.
And so I must admit that where sport has gone now, she was right.
Oh yeah.
In that perspective. And so to somehow keep it be the game and the sporting event would have been nice, because I find a lot of Stanford athletes tell me their sporting experience is more stressful than their academics. And that is crossing a line.
Particularly since very few are going to make it a lifetime experience. It's one of the solid reasons why I really had that need for an idea fundamentally, because there are other kids who want an education, and don't want to just all of a sudden kind of waste it. But you're right. It's It may come back to the point where it's a game again, but I doubt it for a long period of time. We're so involved in what you might call a corporate culture, and almost an individualism that's unparalleled, I think, in the history of the United States, except when you were in the old Wild West, quite frankly. And but I think my whole concept of the directorship fundamentally was to build a team in the department. I thank people after I left. I wrote to everybody, and I think my emphasis was always on the team effort that had been put out, trying to keep everything going. And I think it's the only way I know you can get a cooperative society going on. I've always been taken, even though I'm a Notre Dame graduate and a Catholic, I've always been taken by the cooperation, because I've done a lot of reading of history of the West and of the Mormon experience. They're probably the only people that could have settled that Utah area and done it without having fights among themselves and everything else. It was a cooperative society.
Because Dick Gould says he credits John Ralston with a lot towards in the coaching arena, bringing people together. He said in the old days, before Ralston, that people didn't talk between sports.
Oh, yeah.
And he said Ralston helped consolidate the coaching staff.
Oh, yeah, he did. Yeah. Well, John's a superb guy. In fact, funny thing is that John was playing football at Cal when I was coaching at St. Mary's. Like I was a coach. He beat us. I told John one day, but that was in the 50s, the 1950 when I was coaching at St. Mary's. So I've had my first experience with St. Mary's, or with Stanford, fundamentally came in 1938, the All-Star game in Chicago, the All-Star football game. Remember the old All-Stars used to play against the championship professional team, and they'd select players from different schools around the country to get together for 2 weeks, and then you go out and play the Redskins, or you play, this, that, and the other thing.
So you remember the All-Stars?
I remember the All-Stars, and Jimmy Kofus was a great, famous Stanford football player who used to be a punt returner, catch balls on the fly, but he'd always get way back, and then he'd run up and catch it going full speed. And so that's when I first got to know him. And then of course I got to know it when I was over at St. Mary's, because I'm at Berkeley. I was a student at Berkeley too, as you may or may not know, from 38 to 41, right after the war started. And I was coaching football at that time with Slip Madigan over at St. Mary's College, and Red Strader. And so I used to come down and I'd watch the Stanford games. I saw the first Stanford game against USF in football. Pete Konetovic was on that team, one of the coaches that I got to know later. And so I followed Stanford all the way through, and then I played against Stanford one time when I was with the St. Mary's pre-flight team. After the start of the war, I got into the pre-flight program and was playing with the pre-flight football team before I went overseas. And
so were you?
So I played nose to nose against Chuck Taylor, who was later my coach. Yeah. he was a defensive guard, and I was an offensive guard. And we were playing against each other, offense and defense. So I've had some ties to Stanford that have carried on through the years. So it's been really interesting.
Were you a pilot then? Pre-flight?
Yeah, I flew in the Marine Corps and flew off Jeep carriers, one of those small carriers, Corsairs.
You were in European theater?
No, I was in the Pacific Theater, off Saipan. Yeah. And I didn't get into any combat because by the time we got out there, the war was it wasn't over, but we were still flying missions that could have been combat, but weren't facing really any of the serious things. But it was interesting, So then after the war, that's when I got back to Chicago for graduate work, and then Jenny and I got married in '48, and I couldn't pick out a thesis in anthropology I thought would change the world. So I got an offer to coach football again, so I got back to St. Mary's and coached football.
That's great. It's interesting how the twists and turns that you take through life, and they're never well thought out. They sort of happen sometimes.
Oh yeah.
They're for the best.
Yeah. I guess I'm at that age now when I'm reviewing a lot of the old things, and all the old things that happened. I've got papers that my father pulled together. My dad died here in '86, but he was, I think, 85 or 86 years old. And he had spent 20 years of his life after he retired from his owning a shirt factory. He ran a shirt factory. He had never been to college, and he and his mother and my mother were both German family, and 5 of his children, including myself, attended Notre Dame, and the 2 girls went to St. Mary's College. He put them all through school. Didn't make a lot of money, but my brother, Father Ed, ended up being a priest, and got involved in working with the poor and the Mexican Americans in South Bend. So for 20 years, my father dedicated his life working with those people. And what he did was unbelievable. He was with the St. Vincent de Paul Society in addition to other organizations, and he tried to involve them in some of his work. And he wrote a series of papers for them of case studies of individuals' problems he had handled, without mentioning the actual name of the individual, just putting initials down for privacy purposes. I tell you, done wouldn't fit into the same universe of what he did, quite frankly. And he used to have it, he had it headed, which I thought was a beautiful way of doing it. Come, ... let us visit the poor. And then he'd start out in black families, Mexican-American families, some woman who was demented, you know, and the way he had to follow them until something was done positively or to where it was impossible would span sometimes 5-6 months of constant work with them, you know, and it's unbelievable. So anyhow, I'm trying to pull that stuff together for the kids and everything else and put it in Xerox and make sure it's safe for somebody else to look at sometime.
Right.
And, in fact, I want to give it to Bob Byers because Bob has expressed interest in looking at it, seeing how some individual people can do things that are seemingly unbelievable, particularly somebody who's a successful businessman.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, boom, goes out and does it. I think he used up all their Social Security pay. We never know how much money he spent on the program. It's really amazing. But
And what position is Bob Byers now?
I don't know what Bob's doing. He's working, I think he still works, sends some feature articles into different magazines and everything, maybe the Chronicle of Higher Education, and they're involved also, his wife is involved in traveling the world working with different groups, and exactly what, I really don't know.
Because he was head of News Bureau, right?
Yeah, he's a great guy, very honest, straightforward type of guy. He'd tell the bad with the good. He never would hide. Never try to hide anything that Stanford was doing wrong, which is very unusual in a university exposing itself to that type of thing. And I got a lot of respect for Bob. Great guy.
Well, I know with the archive material, what they've found is that that while the women physical educators left their materials, and Luella Guthrie did a large job of organizing before she passed away, but there's nothing from the male athletic directors.
Yeah.
And I called up John Denny, and
Said he can't find anything.
he said if there was anything, it probably got dumped. Now, I don't know if Andy Geiger...
I think I had heard, I don't know, I never did talk to Andy about it, but I understand that a lot of the old files were dumped, you know, which, so a lot of the things, I kept some things because I was interested in just seeing how the progress made and everything else. But some of the newspaper articles and everything else, I'm keeping a lot of funny things that have happened over the years. Got a letter, my dad wrote a letter to the grandchildren one time. These are the type of things I like to keep, where he says, I'll tell you grandchildren, your granny has accused dad of being an arsonist, you know, and then he goes on to say why she did that. And she should know that grandma didn't cook the stove right, you know, that type of thing. It's really funny to see those things and read them again, because they went to an awful lot of grandchildren, you know. So I guess I'm too nostalgic today for you.
No,
That's
you're doing fine. No, this is really great stuff, because part of this is a sense of the times that I'm hoping to impart. And as I mentioned, there was an 87-year-old woman, I think I mentioned, that we're going to interview with another student.
Yeah.
And because it's hard to get a sense of the times, and hopefully Frederick Glover kept every Caper committee meeting he ever went to, and Dr. Strathern's materials are in the archives. So I think between least we know the last 25 years, I mean, or the beginnings, you know. But before then, it's really lean, I think.
Yeah. Listen, can I get you a cup of coffee or anything?
Oh,
Or
I'm
orange juice?
actually, I don't drink coffee, but
Yeah,
Orange juice? I got some Sunny Delight.
do you have some?
That'd be great.
Yeah,
That would be
great.
wonderful.